Good morning, everyone. See so many here with us. It's always encouraging when people come back from long distances and are with us again. I was kind of expecting Mike and Mary to be here. I hope they are not sick, maybe just not back in town yet. Interesting songs there, especially that last one that George led. And I don't know if anybody looking back and forth to see which music are we going to follow. And I can't read it anyway, so but also that the third verse is different from each of them, and it made me kind of wonder. I wonder how many verses Samuel Stone actually wrote to that. I've seen hymns that were actually written as poetry with 20 verses, and maybe whoever is the editor of a songbook will pull 3 of those or 4 of those out. And there's a lot of other verses that exist out there that are also quite good. But if we actually went and sang 20 verses to a song, it would probably be a little bit excessive. So, but again, good morning. Good to see everyone, and I hope that the things that I have prepared for us today are beneficial. So, we're going to eventually be in Matthew, so you can be turning over there. In the book of Matthew, Jesus uses the phrase "kingdom of heaven" about a dozen times, maybe a little bit less than that, once or twice additionally by reference. And he's teaching his listeners and us about the kingdom of heaven. And he used parables to teach about the kingdom of heaven. And there are a lot of writers in the Bible that teach about the kingdom of heaven. Ezekiel is one of them. And I barely understand a thing that Ezekiel says about the kingdom of heaven. And John really struggles. We've talked about this. John in the book of Revelation also says some things that I just really struggle to wrap my head around, to understand what it is that he's getting across. Obviously, God put that there for a reason, and he wants us to think about those things. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven in the book of Matthew, though, I find it quite easy to understand. Well, some of it. We'll talk about that. But it's a lot clearer, okay? Because he spoke in parables, earthly stories, heavenly meaning, and so we figure out kind of what those things are. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 20. And these parables are kind of interspersed throughout Matthew. They kind of start in chapter 13 and then kind of go on throughout the book. Well, let's read Matthew 20, 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, a denarius was a coin or an amount of money, he sent them into his vineyard, and going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and to them he said, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever's right I will give you." So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." When those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" So the last will be first, and the first last. So we've got this thing about the kingdom of heaven that is being taught about. And this man is out hiring workers in his vineyard, just day laborers. One day they would work here, one day they would work there. Sometimes in the summers you'll see Home Depot maybe in certain areas of the country. Day laborers hanging around waiting for somebody to hire them, so it's still not unusual today. But he hires early in the morning, 6 o'clock, okay, and goes back at 9, goes back at noon, okay, goes back at 3 in the afternoon, the way I read it, I think, And again, at the 11th hour, so they're working 12-hour days. Pretty long day to be working in a vineyard. And payment time came, and the guys that only worked an hour, he gives them a full day's wages. And all the way up to the first guys, and they're kind of thinking, hey, I'm going to make a lot more than what he told me. But he only pays them what he agreed to. When they were not paid more, they complained about it, and he kind of straightens it up. When I read this, and I remember this story, even hearing about it when I was a young child, I think, and it always struck me that he was being a little bit unfair. Okay, was he being unfair? He was not being unfair. Then I think, well, was he being unwise? I have to struggle with that a little bit, because since being a young kid, now I'm trained as an accountant, and accountants think certain ways. And guess what happens on day 2 when he goes out to hire laborers again? Has anybody else ever had this thought? Because it's what occurs to me when I read this story. On day 2, what are the workers going to do when they see him coming at 6 o'clock in the morning? Hide. Okay. I know you wouldn't, Gary, because you work hard. I would probably hide and wait for the 11th hour of the day. That's kind of my nature too. And so I think maybe it wasn't really the wise way to conduct your business. And that's where I kind of start thinking about it. What would you do? Is it a way to run a business? Is he setting himself up for problems down the road? These are the things that occur to me. And partly because I just have that accounting mindset that is so dangerous in certain things. Now, luckily, when Jesus told this story, and luckily it's written down, but luckily when he started this off, he knew that thick-headed people like John were going to read this story someday. And so how does he start his story? The kingdom of heaven is like, okay? He starts off with an analogy. It's clear from the beginning he's going to do a comparison of something that would have an earthly meaning, an earthly story that has that heavenly meaning. Not everything in the story is going to have a direct counterpart to the things that we might think about, and so we can't go around looking for absolutely every comparison whatsoever. And Jesus also ends the story with the master saying, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Okay? Or do you begrudge my generosity? Okay? So John puts his accounting hat away. If the accountants ever wore hats. green eye shade type of thing. Okay, and that kind of brings the reality back of, this is not a story about business, is it? It's a story about heaven. Okay? And there's some things that we need to learn. But in the story, as we read through it, I have a thing up there. How do I get rid of that, Jonathan? Yeah. Great. Now you know my lesson. Well, I'm sorry. Deal with that if you can. In this story, God's the master. Okay? That's who is what we're supposed to take from this. That God is the master of this house and the owner of this vineyard. Christians are the laborers. Okay? And the parable is meant to answer the question about whether the reward given to the person who becomes a Christian late in their life, okay, is the reward given to them going to be the same reward as the person who becomes a Christian at a young age, okay, and who's labored hour after hour and day after day? Are they going to get the same reward as the person who comes to Christianity late in life? And the answer is, yeah, same reward, and that reward is heaven. Okay, that's what this story is about. And really it becomes a story about generosity. Okay, it has very little to do with the vineyard, very little to do with labor. It's about God's generosity, is what this story is about. And when we get nearer the end, we'll talk about some of the other kingdom of heaven parables that he uses. So don't forget about that all completely. But generosity, just kind of a general definition of generosity, the personal quality of being kind, understanding, and not selfish. To be generous is to provide something under your control in order to come to the assistance of someone in need. Okay, these are acts of generosity, and the question that we all have to face is, how will we use the resources that God has given us to use? Okay, and Lee touched on this a little bit this morning. Turn over to Luke 10. We're all familiar, very familiar with this story. In Luke 10, the story of the Good Samaritan, and if you've been following along in the daily Bible reading that we have, I think this was in yesterday's Bible reading maybe. So, starting in verse 25 of Luke chapter 10, and you're all very familiar with this. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put Jesus to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he, this is the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, Who's my neighbor? And then Jesus replies to the story of the Good Samaritan. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, 2 days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. And so we see generosity on the part of a Samaritan. And what did the Jews think about Samaritans? Hated them. Thought they were dirty. But it was the Samaritan that was the one that had the generous heart. Okay? It wasn't the Levite. It wasn't the priest. It was the outcast that had the generosity toward this man. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially those who are of the household of faith. This is a verse that probably what I need to read every day. Okay, but this verse speaks to priorities, doesn't it? Okay, we're to be generous to everyone. First of all, even our enemies. Even our enemies. Okay, even our enemies. Romans 12, verse 20, we won't have to jump over there, but it says something along the lines of, Be kind to your enemies and you will heap burning coals on his head. Okay? We have to be careful when we're doing good to our enemies, that we're not doing it for the wrong motivation. We should not understand, hey, I'm going to heap burning coals on his head, so if that becomes our motivation, so I'll be nice to him, then we've got that backwards. Okay, but be nice to him. And ideally what that will do is wake him up. Okay, coals on my head would wake me up. And then maybe he would change his actions toward you. But even our enemies we're to be nice to. And then it says, especially to those who are of the household of faith. So make it a priority to be generous to your brethren first. Okay? And if there's somehow a tie out there, I don't think God will put us in a tie. I think he'll give us the resources we need to be kind in both places. I was thinking about all the different places where you can go to prove generosity in the Bible, and the whole Bible is really about generosity. Specifically God's generosity and mankind's response to that generosity. It's not always a good story, not the way that it ought to be. Too often mankind doesn't live up to God's example, does he? We don't. In James chapter 4, it seems like somebody talked about this just the other day. But in James 4:17, most of you can probably quote this. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And then in Ephesians 2:10, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. And so we have this obligation as Christians to be generous, to use the resources God has given us to help others that are around us. Very simple sort of thing. And so what are these resources? And I kind of tried to figure out what are the resources that occur to me as I think about the things that God has given me. And I know I've missed many, many, many of those things. But in general, I think there are kind of 5 categories, and I'll try to give you examples in each of these categories. The first of those is time. God's given us time. Okay? And we have to see that time is a resource, and we have to be wise with our time. We can be selfish with our time and spend all of our time on ourselves, or we can be generous with our time and spend it for other people's benefit. And we have to be wise in that regard about how we are going to do that. And a number of verses that you can think of that talk about those sorts of things. As a personal experience I had, and I don't know if I've shared this or not, but years ago in Tingsboro, when we were over there, and this is going back 20 years anyway, there was an elderly lady there who was a member of the congregation whose son was just a ne'er-do-well, okay, never had been employed, had children, and you try to help them out, And at one point, I don't remember exactly what the situation was, but I was over at the house replacing either the starter or the alternator on his truck because he couldn't get the thing started and doing all this, and he wasn't there. But after I was finished, I went into the house to kind of clean up. I saw him laying on the couch watching television. Okay. Was I doing him any favors in the time? Not at all. Not at all. And so, be wise as serpent, innocent as doves, go into that innocent as doves, walked out wise as a serpent, I hope, realizing that I really wasn't doing him any good at all because I was doing the things that he was perfectly capable of doing. Or at least stand there and hand me a wrench. Nothing about me or anything else, but something that needed to be done that just was not there. And I finally came to the realization, until this fellow's children get hungry enough that they are tugging on his arm, Dad, I'm hungry, Dad, I'm hungry, Dad, I'm hungry. Anything I could help was not going to motivate him to do the right thing at all. That motivation had to come from within. Is that heartless? It's not. Okay? One of the verses you're all familiar with is, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. It doesn't say if a man cannot work, then there's an obligation. But if a man will not work, then hunger will be the motivation that God brings to him so that he will work, okay? That he has that motivation to work. Another example of this issue of time, for the last 2 Saturdays, I've had brethren from the church here in our house. Not that I could help them or anything else, but they've been there working on cars. And I didn't have the time to help. I didn't have the knowledge to help. But somebody else in this congregation had both of those things, and I could provide space. Okay? And so that individual was there, taking time from his weekend to help both of those things happen. And that's an example of the kind of generosity that I see when I look throughout the whole congregation. We're going to talk about a couple more examples like that. Those are examples of using one's time. Another resource is talent, and talent goes a lot along, I think, with time. All of us have different skills and abilities. 1 Corinthians 12 kind of comes to mind, the members of the body, the hand, the foot, that kind of thing. If you're sick and need a nourishing meal, do you want to get a hold of me and I'll bring you a beef stick and a can of chili to heat up? Or would you rather have a pot of chicken soup from somebody here that can actually cook? Okay? You'd rather have the pot of soup from somebody, okay? Because somebody has a much better ability in that regard. I know of at least 5 people in this room yesterday that had a meal in some other Christian's house. Those are the ones I know about, okay? Those are examples of generosity. Talent and time fit together pretty well because a lot of times a person with talent can do something in a lot less time than the person without the talent for doing it. Okay, so they're tied together quite well. If you need a house built, don't come to me. Okay, go to Marcus and Steve, because Marcus and Steve can handle that much, much faster than what I can. I think I've proven that to everybody. It's because they've got a talent there, talent that I don't have. There are resources that we have that are physical resources, and I'm not talking yet about financial resources. We'll handle that differently. Go into, turn to the book of Acts, chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, read verse 44, and then we'll switch over to Acts 4. This is just kind of the initial beginnings of the church, and all these people are in Jerusalem and from all other places around the globe, in some cases maybe, or around the known world. And there were needs. Acts chapter 2, 44, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. Acts chapter 4, verse 32, somewhat similar. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and one soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. And so they're talking about physical resources that people have. I suspect a lot of it was food, but it might have been lodging and any number of things. Some people have taken those verses right there and argued from it that we need to pattern ourselves in society in a socialist economic system, where somebody else is going to kind of decide who gets what and who needs what and everything else. And they really kind of use these to destroy the concept of personal property. I think it's a real misuse of those verses. I do think they teach that we ought to be willing to share with one another as the opportunity arises. And I think the summary verse, our main text this morning when I started off, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Okay, same sort of thing. The concept of personal property is in there, along with the responsibility to use that personal property. And so we all share with one another as we have opportunity. I've got a post hole digger at my house. Okay, as an example of this. It's been there for 3 or 4 years. Okay, it's been used at the Moors. It's been used, my son has used it. I think the Reeds have used it. Lee's used it. It's been used all over. The only person in the congregation, not the only person, but the one person I know I've never seen use it is the one who the post hole digger belongs to. Okay? Because we share and share alike. We know how much labor something like that will save. I happen to have the same person's chainsaw in my garage right now too. Okay? That's generosity. Okay? That's examples of the sorts of things. In this congregation, I don't think we've ever been in a congregation that had families had so many different trailers. Does that strike anybody else at all? There must be 9 or 10 different trailers around here. I've borrowed all but one of them. I was trying to count yesterday, okay? I haven't borrowed one of them, but I've borrowed all the others at one time or another. And the only time it's ever been turned down is because somebody else in the congregation was using it. Okay? Those are examples of generosity. Those are examples, I think, of how those verses in Acts are meant to be played out. Okay? Because it's a generous nature that makes those things happen. And I think that's a lot better than some bureaucrat deciding that we all will own everything in common, and I'll let you know when you can use something that belongs to the state itself, for somebody else to decide what's fair when it comes to distributing things. And I mention those things because those are the things that immediately come to mind to me. I know that there are dozens of examples, hundreds maybe. There are a lot of other examples out there, and you guys are thinking of them, and that's fine. Those are examples of generosity. And I think one of the keys to remember here is that generosity is one of the ways that love manifests itself. It's how love shows itself, by people being generous to one another with whatever it is that they have available to them. Financial resources are kind of a subset of physical resources. But, there's a bit of a difference in there. I'm talking physical things versus monetary sorts of things. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. We have a financial responsibility to provide for our families. That can be our children, that can be our siblings, sisters, brothers, it can be our parents, okay? All of those things apply. It can be extended family, aunts, uncles, that sort of thing. We have that obligation there. We have a financial obligation to our spiritual brethren individually, okay? In Galatians 6:10 that we already talked to, certainly speaks to that, okay? I'm talking about individually. If somebody who is a brother has a financial need, then I have an obligation to try to fulfill that. Making sure that it's something that is also good for them, okay? It's not so that they can lay on the couch and watch TV while I'm replacing a starter or something like that. We also have an obligation to the congregation as a whole when we gather together, okay? I mean, that obligation is expressed in our offerings. So the church has a mission of seeking and saving the lost, and if we're going to be part of that, then we have an obligation to support that effort. There are principles, I think, that are involved in that. One of them is it's not how much you give, it's how much you keep. Okay? Look at in Mark chapter 12. This is starting in verse 44. This is Jesus talking about the widow's offering. He says, Jesus, sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called the disciples to him and said, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box, for they contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. And so the principle there is, how much are you keeping? Okay. It's something that needs to be considered. For her, she gave out of her poverty and gave everything she had. Is the Lord able to watch over her? Yes. Okay. I'm not suggesting we all give everything and make ourselves destitute and then rely on the church. Okay. But the principle behind this, it's not how much you give, it's how much you keep. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The gift must be accompanied by a readiness to give and cheerfulness. 2 Corinthians speaks to this several times. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12. For the readiness, and this is the readiness to give is there, is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. Okay? We're not obligated to give beyond our means. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So there's got to be a readiness to give and a cheerfulness in giving. Almost the attitude that I wish I could give more. That does not hurt at all to give with that kind of a mindset. Another thing is that another principle, you cannot outgive God. Okay? Right there in 2 Corinthians 9, back up one verse to verse 6. The point is this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And verse 8, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. Giving of our financial means is one of those good works, okay? God is able to provide more to us than we can ever give back. when it comes to the financial resources, I think that there are practical applications to this. Sometimes Ron and I are trying to come to a meeting of the minds on something. She'll want me to do something, and give me a drawing. Show me in concrete what it is you're talking about, because I just can't see what she's talking about. I kind of feel that obligation in talking about financial resources to figure out how much should a person give. There were rules in the Old Testament. Okay? Rules. In the New Testament, there are not rules so much as there are guidelines, principles involved, and I think one of those is that we are all obligated to be good stewards of all the resources God's given to us. So the question comes to me, and that's where I put my green eye shade back on as the accountant. Do you know where your money goes? Do you have any idea what you spend your money on? We ought to have that in mind. The parable of the talents talks about the responsibility we have to take care of the resources God has given us. And the things that I ask myself is, do I spend more money on my contribution to the church or on fancy restaurants or restaurants at all? Do I spend more of my money on entertainment or my contribution to the church? Do I spend more money on fancy clothing and cars or on charity? Okay? Because those sorts of questions are the questions that narrow in on what my priorities are with the resources that God has given me. And I don't know if those are the right questions to ask. Okay? I have no idea. The Bible doesn't say those are the right questions you need to be asking, John. But the principles are out there. Those are the questions that kind of occur to me when I start looking at this. In Matthew 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Okay. Now, I kind of use the contribution to the church in there, but it's really kind of a euphemism for all of the charitable work that we do financially, okay? Not just in the church, but whatever else we might do that's outside of the church as well. And I think, this is a struggle. I think God wants it to be a struggle for us. He wants us to think about this, I believe. Okay? If He didn't want us to think about it, I think He could have said, 10%, you're good to go. I had a friend in the Mormon church, I think it was the Mormon church, and at the end of the year, they basically send you a bill. There's what you should have given, because we know how much you made. Nice hard and fast rule. What if God wanted more? Because you had more to give. Okay? God blessed you with more. Maybe you should have been given a lot more than what you should have. So, I do think we ought to struggle with it, think about it, and then be generous and cheerful. Okay? And then let not the right hand know what the left hand is doing. Okay? That we not begrudge that, but we be happy about our ability to provide and contribute. Spiritual resources. God gives us spiritual resources too. Some of that is just a spiritual strength that we may have to endure something that, or help somebody else endure something and get through it because we have endured it ourselves. Do we take time to study with somebody else when the opportunity arises? That's a resource of our time. We should have developed that talent to do that. Have we done those things? I don't want to answer for me. Okay? But have I done those things? When Ron and I were first converted, there was a couple named Dick and Beth Jones that spent a lot of time studying with us, probably a year and a half, I would guess, something like that. And once a week, once every 2 weeks, we were fairly consistent with it. We went and sat down and opened the Bible and studied. And I really appreciated their time. Okay? They're very, very generous with their time. It was, we just enjoyed being with them, but we enjoyed opening a Bible, asking questions, and getting Bible answers. Okay? How could your time be spent any better than that on their part? On our part too. It certainly benefited us a lot. In fact, it was in one of those studies, and I can't remember much specific about any of those studies over the course of a year and a half. Can you imagine that? With my memory. Who would have thought? But I do remember this. One time we were talking about the contribution, and she said, you can't outgive God. You take time to pray with someone else. You remember to pray for them on your own prayer time. Okay? This is your spiritual obligation. It's your spiritual opportunity. Do you remember to mention those people by name that need prayers? Okay? Whether they're over in Africa, or an Amazonian, or an African in Amazon, okay? Do you think about praying for those people? What better of a gift could you give to them? Okay, what resources that you've been given. You find ways to be of spiritual encouragement to your brethren. I think I see a lot of that around here. Okay, it's a good thing. But do we even think about those are the things that we are doing? I mean, ideally, it would become such a part of your nature you no longer need to think about it anymore, okay? It's not yet a part of my nature. I need to think about that and work harder at that than what I do. Other spiritual resources, study materials, it kind of comes to mind quickly. At one time or another, Leah's given me so many books that I started putting those little address stickers you get in the mail? I started putting those in all my books so that I would remember which ones belonged to somebody else. Okay? So that I get those things back to Lee again. And we share things like that around because those are things that help one another out. Okay? That's what generosity is. That's generosity. God is generous, and we are meant to be generous like Him. We started today talking about the kingdom of heaven, and I mentioned some of these other parables that Jesus taught in reference to the kingdom of heaven. I think all these are in the book of Matthew. All of them I have in the book of Matthew. I'm not sure the phrase is even used in some of the others. My software didn't bring it up. But in Matthew 24, you remember the parable of the weeds? A landowner plants something and somebody else comes in and scatters weed seed in there. Okay? The lesson behind that, the specifics are not so much important, but the lesson behind it is that there's a day coming when saint and sinner will be judged and separated. That's the lesson of that parable about the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew 18, there's the parable of the unforgiving servant. Okay? Remember that one? The master forgives this servant of an enormous amount of money, and he is not forgiving of the servant below him. That's a lesson about forgiveness and the attitude of forgiveness that we have to maintain if we are going to enter heaven. In the parable of the 10 virgins and waiting for the bridegroom, this is in Matthew 25, we learn there we've got to be ready at all times because the end, our end, okay, your end may come suddenly. And so it is important to be ready for it at all times. In Matthew 22, the parable of the wedding feast, we learn we have to be pure to enter the kingdom of heaven. We've got to be pure. And like was said this morning, are any of us pure? Not a one of us are pure. Okay. Not a one of us has passed the purity test to get into heaven. But we have a generous God, okay, who gave His own Son to die for our sins, and all He asks is that we repent and be immersed to accept that gift of His generosity. And that's not it's not even a low price to pay. It's a very easy price that we should be able to be willing to pay. So that we can, again, accept what a generous God has given to us. So, if you'd like to accept that gift, we certainly invite you to come forward and let us know that you want to become a Christian. If you are a member of the church, struggle with something, need the prayers of the church, then we also set aside this time for you so that you can let us know so that we can try to be as generous as we can. help you through this part of our existence as we look forward to the next part of our existence.